Many empaths believe their greatest strength is feeling everything, every mood in the room, every hidden tension, every silent pain no one else notices. But something strange happens after years of emotional overload. One day, the empath goes quiet, cold, detached, almost emotionless, and people around them panic because the person who once absorbed everyone's emotions suddenly feels nothing. What most people don't realize is this isn't weakness. It's a psychological survival mechanism. The human brain was never designed to carry the emotional weight of an entire room for years without consequences. Neuroscience shows that highly sensitive people often experience stronger activation in mirror neuron systems, the part of the brain linked to empathy and emotional mimicry. That means empaths don't just understand emotions. They physically internalize them. Stress hormones rise, cortisol stays elevated, emotional exhaustion becomes biological exhaustion, and eventually the nervous system. DM does something terrifying. It shuts the doors. Psychologists call this emotional numbing. But in many empaths, it's more strategic than pathological. The brain realizes constant emotional exposure is dangerous, so it reduces emotional responsiveness to survive. Suddenly, the empath who cried over everyone becomes unreadable. Calm during chaos, silent during conflict, detached from drama that once consumed them. This transformation shocks people because they confuse emotional expression with emotional depth, but often the empath hasn't stopped feeling. They've simply stopped leaking emotion into the world. And this changes everything, because an emotionless empath becomes extremely difficult to manipulate. For years, toxic personalities survive by controlling emotional reactions. They provoke guilt, fear, sympathy, obligation. They rely on predictable empathy responses. But when the empath becomes emotionally regulated instead of emotionally reactive, manipulators lose their power. Worse, this is why certain people become angry when an empath heals. The empath no longer explains themselves endlessly, no longer chases closure, no longer absorbs emotional responsibility for everyone else's behavior. Their silence feels threatening because emotionally healthy detachment exposes unhealthy dependency in others. In behavioral psychology, this is connected to reinforcement patterns. Toxic people repeat behaviors that reward them emotionally. If guilt trips work, they continue. If emotional chaos gets attention, they escalate. But once the empath stops emotionally feeding the cycle, the manipulator experiences psychological withdrawal. Suddenly, the empath is called cold, selfish, arrogant, emotionless. But what's really happening is boundary formation. And boundaries feel like rejection to people who benefited from your lack of them. What makes this transformation powerful is that the empath finally begins operating from observation instead of absorption. Chase Hughes often talks about behavioral awareness, pattern recognition, and emotional control as social superpowers. The emotionless empath unintentionally develops all three. Instead of drowning in emotions, they start reading them. They notice micro-expressions, vocal tension, contradictions between words and behavior. They stop listening to what people say and start watching what people consistently do. Emotional distance sharpens perception. This is why healed empaths often become terrifyingly accurate at reading people. Not because they became psychic, because emotional neutrality increases cognitive clarity. Studies in neuroscience suggest heightened emotional arousal reduces rational processing in the prefrontal cortex. When emotions dominate, perception narrows. But when emotional regulation increases, pattern detection improves. The empath begins seeing manipulation loops, passive aggression, insecurity signals, and deceptive behaviors they previously ignored due to emodio. Now attachment. And here's the part nobody warns you about. Once an empath reaches this stage, loneliness can appear, because they start seeing how much of human interaction depends on emotional performance. Fake concern, strategic kindness, conditional affection. Social masks become obvious. Conversations feel scripted. Relationships feel transactional. The empath who once begged to be understood now craves distance because overstimulation feels physically exhausting. But this phase is not the end. It's recalibration. The goal is not becoming permanently emotionless. The goal is becoming emotionally selective. There's a massive psychological difference. An unhealthy numb person suppresses emotions because they fear them. A healed empath controls emotional access because they respect their nervous system. That distinction changes your entire life. The healthiest empaths learn to use emotional energy intentionally instead of automatically. They stop giving empathy to everyone equally. They understand empathy without discernment becomes self-destruction, and science supports this. Research on emotional labor shows chronic emotional overextension increases anxiety, burnout, fatigue, and even immune dysfunction. Constant emotional monitoring drains cognitive resources. That's why many empaths feel physically tired after social interaction. Their brains are processing emotional data non-stop, but once emotional boundaries are established, energy returns. Sleep improves. Mental clarity sharpens. Decision-making becomes faster. Stress tolerance increases. And most importantly, self-respect finally develops. Because many empaths secretly confuse self-sacrifice with goodness. They believe suffering for others makes them valuable. But psychologically, this often comes from conditioning. Childhood environments where emotional caretaking created safety. Homes where reading moods prevented conflict. Relationships where love depended on emotional service. So, the empath becomes hyper-attuned to everyone except themselves. Until one day, exhaustion forces evolution. There comes a moment in the life of almost every empath when something inside them quietly dies. Not their heart, not their humanity, but the endless emotional openness that once defined who they were. The crying stops. The over-explaining stops. The desperate need to rescue everyone disappears. And the people around them become confused because the person who once felt everything suddenly feels unreachable. What nobody realizes is that this transformation is not random. It is biological, psychological, neurological. The empath did not become cold overnight. Their nervous system forced an emergency shutdown after years of emotional overload. Science has discovered that highly empathetic individuals often experience stronger activation in mirror neuron systems, the brain circuits connected to emotional imitation and social sensitivity. This means empaths do not simply understand pain intellectually. Their brains simulate it internally. When someone suffers around them, their body responds almost as if the suffering belongs to them. Heart rate changes. Stress hormones rise. Emotional tension becomes physical chemistry. Imagine carrying that every single day for years. Most people walk into a room and notice conversation. Empaths walk into a room and absorb atmosphere. They feel the anger hidden behind smiles, the anxiety under silence, the sadness disguised as humor. Their nervous systems scan emotional danger constantly, even when nothing is spoken aloud. And at first, this gift feels meaningful. They become the healer, the listener, the safe place everyone runs to when life falls apart. People praise their kindness, their patience, their emotional depth. But behind the scenes, something dangerous is happening inside the empath's body. Chronic emotional stress slowly destroys the nervous system. Research from the American Psychological Association has linked NCAD prolonged emotional stress to elevated cortisol levels, weakened immunity, digestive disorders, insomnia, anxiety, memory problems, and even cardiovascular strain. The empath thinks they are just tired, but their biology is entering survival mode. The body keeps score of emotions the mind tries to ignore. Many empaths begin experiencing strange symptoms without realizing the connection. Exhaustion after social interaction. Random headaches. Chest tightness. Emotional numbness. Sudden irritability. Brain fog. Feeling disconnected from themselves. Their nervous system becomes overstimulated for so long that eventually it cannot maintain emotional intensity anymore. So the brain adapts. An adaptation can look terrifying. Psychologists call it emotional numbing, a defense mechanism where the brain reduces emotional responsiveness to protect itself from overload. Trauma researchers have observed this in people exposed to chronic stress, toxic relationships, emotional abuse, or overwhelming caregiving roles. The brain understands a brutal truth before the conscious mind does. Too much emotional exposure becomes dangerous. This is why some empaths suddenly wake up one day feeling empty. They are not broken. Their nervous system is exhausted from carrying emotions that were never theirs to begin with. And the scary part is most people punish empaths for reaching this stage. The same people who benefited from the empath's emotional labor suddenly accuse them of changing. You used to care. You've become distant. You're cold now. But what they are really mourning is the loss of unlimited emotional access, because society rewards self-sacrificing empaths until those empaths finally stop sacrificing themselves. The human brain has limits. Neuroscientists have repeatedly shown that chronic emotional stress weakens activity in areas connected to rational thinking and emotional regulation. The prefrontal cortex becomes exhausted while the amygdala, the brain's emotional center, is activated. EN's fear and stress center remains hyperactive. Over time, the empath becomes trapped in a cycle of emotional hypervigilance, always scanning, always feeling, always carrying, until eventually the brain says enough. And when that shutdown happens, it feels almost unreal. The empath who once cried for everyone can suddenly sit in silence without reacting. Emotional stories that once consumed them barely register. Drama becomes exhausting instead of interesting. Conflict feels physically repulsive. Their nervous system no longer wants intensity. It wants safety. This is the phase people misunderstand the most, because emotional numbness is not always cruelty. Sometimes it is survival after years of invisible psychological bleeding. Many empaths were conditioned in childhood to become emotional caretakers long before adulthood. Studies on family trauma and attachment patterns show that children raised in unpredictable or emotionally unstable environments often develop hypersensitivity to moods and behavioral changes. They learn to read facial expressions, tone shifts, and emotional tension as survival mechanisms. A child who constantly monitors emotions becomes an adult who absorbs them automatically. That is why so many empaths feel responsible for everyone's emotional state. Their nervous system was trained to believe emotional management equals safety. If others are upset, they panic internally. If others suffer, they feel guilty resting. If conflict appears, they immediately try to fix it. But living this way slowly destroys identity, because the empath becomes so focused on everyone else's emotions that they lose connection to their own. And eventually, emotional shutdown becomes the only remaining form of self-protection. Some empaths describe this stage as feeling emotionally underwater. Others say they feel detached from reality itself. What once hurt deeply now barely creates reaction. But beneath the numbness is often extreme nervous system fat. BEG. The body is conserving emotional energy because it no longer trusts the environment. This is why isolation suddenly feels comforting. Silence feels medicinal. Distance feels safe. For the first time in their lives, the empath experiences moments where they are not carrying everyone else's emotional weight. And even though the numbness can feel frightening, it also creates clarity. Because when emotions stop flooding the nervous system nonstop, observation improves. The empath begins noticing patterns they previously ignored. Manipulation becomes easier to detect. Fake concern becomes obvious. Emotional users become visible. The empath realizes how many relationships survived only because they were endlessly giving emotional energy away. And this realization changes them permanently. Not into a monster, into someone awake. The most shocking truth many empaths discover is that some people never loved them for who they were. They loved the access, the emotional labor, the reassurance, the healing presence, the constant availability. And when the empath finally becomes emotionally unavailable, those relationships collapse almost instantly. That collapse reveals everything. But here is the part nobody talks about enough. The numbness is not meant to become your identity forever. It is a recovery phase, a nervous system trying to rebuild itself after years of emotional overexposure. The healthiest empaths eventually learn something powerful. Empathy is not supposed to function without boundaries. Human beings are not designed to emotionally absorb every environment they enter. Emotional intelligence without emotional protection becomes self-destruction. And once the empath understands this, the healing truly begins. They stop reacting instantly. They stop rescuing people who refuse to save themselves. They stop confusing guilt with compassion. They stop apologizing for needing space. And slowly, emotion returns in a healthier form. Not chaotic. Emotion, controlled emotion, intentional emotion. The empath learns that true emotional strength is not feeling everything all the time. True strength is deciding what deserves emotional access to your nervous system And that realization changes the entire course of their life, because the empath who once drowned in everyone else's emotions finally understands the most important psychological truth of all. Protecting your peace is not becoming heartless. It is finally teaching your nervous system that your life matters too. The moment an empath stops reacting emotionally, an invisible war begins around them. People who once felt powerful in their presence suddenly become uncomfortable. Conversations change. Tension rises. Toxic personalities grow irritated for reasons they cannot fully explain. Because the empath they once controlled through guilt, pressure, and emotional chaos has become emotionally still. And emotional stillness terrifies manipulators. For years, the empath, was predictable. If someone cried, they rushed to help. If someone pulled away, they chased reassurance. If someone created conflict, they immediately blamed themselves. Their empathy became an open doorway that others walked through without permission. And most of the time, the empath never noticed it happening because emotional manipulation rarely looks violent in the beginning. It looks like guilt, obligation, silent disappointment, emotional withdrawal. Psychologists have long studied how manipulative behavior operates through reinforcement systems inside the brain. Human beings repeat behaviors that reward them emotionally. If guilt-tripping someone produces attention, the brain learns that guilt becomes a useful tool. If emotional chaos creates control, the behavior strengthens neurologically over time. This means manipulators are not always consciously evil. Many are psychologically conditioned to survive through emotional control, and empaths are often the perfect target. BD. Because empaths naturally search for emotional harmony. They want peace, connection, understanding. They instinctively try to reduce suffering in others. But manipulative personalities learn to weaponize that compassion. Slowly, subtly, almost invisibly. The empath begins carrying emotions that do not belong to them. A toxic friend has a bad day, and somehow the empath feels responsible. A partner becomes distant, and the empath immediately searches for what they did wrong. A family member explodes emotionally, and the empath absorbs the tension like a sponge. Over time, this creates dangerous psychological conditioning. The empath's nervous system becomes trained to prioritize external emotional stability over internal mental health. Their peace depends on everyone else being emotionally okay. But science reveals something terrifying about living this way. Chronic emotional stress changes the brain physically. Studies using brain imaging have shown prolonged exposure to Stress increases activity in the amygdala, the fear processing center of the brain, while weakening regions associated with decision-making and emotional regulation. Cortisol floods the body repeatedly. Sleep quality declines. Immune function weakens. Anxiety increases. The empath begins living in a state of constant emotional alertness without realizing it. And manipulators benefit from that exhaustion, because exhausted people are easier to control. An emotionally drained empath questions themselves constantly. They overanalyze conversations. They apologize for things they never caused. They become desperate to restore emotional balance, even if it costs their own mental stability. But then something changes. One day, the empath stops reacting. Not because they stopped caring, because they became aware. And awareness is dangerous to manipulative people. Behavioral experts often explain that emotional reactions are a form of psychological fuel. Manipulators study reactions more than words. They watch what triggers guilt, fear, sympathy, insecurity, or urgency. Once they discover the emotional buttons that work, they keep pressing them. But when the empath becomes emotionally regulated, the entire system collapses. The guilt no longer works instantly. The silent treatment loses power. The emotional chaos stops producing panic, and suddenly the manipulator feels exposed. This is why toxic personalities often become more aggressive when empaths heal. It is not because the empath became cruel. It is because emotional control removes psychological access. And people become angry when they lose access they were never entitled to. The empath begins saying fewer words. They stop defending themselves endlessly. They stop explaining boundaries to people committed to misunderstanding them. And this emotional restraint creates something incredibly powerful: observation. For the first time, the empath watches instead of absorbs. They notice contradictions between we-ing words and actions. They recognize fake apologies that never lead to changed behavior. They begin understanding that emotional intensity does not equal emotional sincerity. And neuroscience supports this transformation. Research shows heightened emotional arousal narrows perception and impairs rational processing. When emotions overwhelm the nervous system, the brain prioritizes survival over analysis. But emotional regulation restores cognitive clarity. Pattern recognition improves. Decision-making sharpens. Behavioral inconsistencies become easier to detect. This is why healed empaths often become exceptionally skilled at reading people. Not because they developed supernatural abilities, because emotional distance reveals truth. The empath starts noticing micro-expressions that flash across faces for fractions of a second. Forced smiles, fake concern, contempt hidden behind politeness. Behavioral analysts have documented how involuntary facial expressions often reveal emotion. Now states before conscious masking occurs. Most people miss these signals because they are emotionally distracted. But the regulated empath notices everything. Tone changes, energy shifts, manipulation patterns repeating in cycles, and once these patterns become visible, the empath can never fully unsee them again. This creates one of the loneliest phases of healing. Because the empath begins realizing how many relationships depended on emotional access rather than genuine love. Some people were attached to the empath's usefulness, not their humanity. They loved the constant emotional availability, the reassurance, the patience, the endless understanding. But when the empath stops emotionally overfunctioning, those connections often weaken or disappear entirely, and that loss can feel devastating. Yet psychologically, it reveals something important. Healthy relationships survive boundaries. Manipulative ones collapse under them. The empath finally understands that exhaustion was never proof of love. Constant self-sacrifice was not emotional maturity. It was nervous system conditioning. And once this realization sinks in, confidence begins returning. The empath becomes harder to intimidate because emotional stability reduces fear-based decision-making. Studies in stress psychology show emotionally regulated individuals are less reactive under social pressure and more resistant to coercive influence. Their nervous system no longer interprets every conflict as danger. This changes body language dramatically. The empath's posture shifts. Their voice slows down. Eye contact becomes steadier. Silence stops feeling uncomfortable. And people sense this transformation instantly. Because calmness carries power in a world addicted to emotional chaos. Manipulators especially struggle with emotionally grounded people because emotional grounding removes unpredictability. The empath no longer rushes to fix discomfort. They no longer panic when Mione withdraws affection. They no longer chase emotional validation from unstable individuals. Instead, they observe. And observation without emotional panic becomes psychological armor. But perhaps the most important change happens internally. The empath finally stops abandoning themselves to maintain connection. That single shift changes everything. For years, they believed being needed meant being loved. They believed emotional suffering proved loyalty. They believed enduring emotional exhaustion made them compassionate. Now they understand a painful truth. Empathy without boundaries invites exploitation. And emotional control is not coldness. It is self-respect. The healed empath still feels deeply. They still care. They still understand pain faster than most people ever will. But now their empathy is intentional instead of automatic, protected instead of exposed, balanced instead of self-destructive. And ironically, this version of the empath becomes stronger than Eve. Before. Because the person who controls their emotions becomes nearly impossible to manipulate. Not because they stopped having a heart, but because they finally stopped handing it to people who never deserved access to it in the first place. Most people misunderstand what happens when an empath finally changes. They assume the empath became cold, detached, heartless. But the truth is far more disturbing. The empath did not stop feeling emotions. They stopped allowing the world unlimited access to their nervous